The orchard smelled like scorched bark and wet iron, the kind of silence that comes only after something violent. The Panzer crew walked with rifles half raised, boots sinking into churned earth, eyes scanning for movement that would never come. The American Sherman tank sat half sunken near the center, its hull cracked open and turret frozen in an awkward twist toward the tree line. No smoke, no crew, no sounds. Just a ghost of machinery, waiting for something that would never return. Sergeant Otto Drexler was the first to approach, his hand pressed against the warm metal as if it might respond. The tank had clearly been disabled, its left tread sheared by a mine or shell, but everything else about it seemed intact enough to spark a dangerous idea. They had been retreating through this part of the French countryside for days, their own Panther crippled by lack of parts and a shattered gearbox. Cut off from high command and unsure of the front line's true position, the crew was running on instinct and memory. Supplies were low. Ammunition was nearly gone. The maps meant little now, and the roads they used were clogged with refugees, twisted wreckage, and horses that had outlived their usefulness. The sight of the Sherman had pulled them off the dirt road in silence, not out of tactical necessity but some deeper impulse. They didn't know what they were doing yet, only that something had to change. Corporal Heiner Weber circled the Sherman with careful steps, crouching near the mangled tread and peering into the wheel housing. "Engine block might still be good," he muttered. Otto didn't answer. He was still staring into the open hatch where the American crew had once sat. A burned glove lay on the driver's seat. No bodies, no blood. Just the residue of something sudden and final. He imagined a shell bursting nearby, the crew scattering, dying, escaping who could know. The war had erased so many names from both sides. Now here was a machine meant to kill Germans, possibly offering to carry them home instead. They made camp nearby, concealed under the orchard's charred canopy. Rations were boiled over a fuel tablet, and no one spoke about what they were going to do. But the decision was already forming without words. If they could fix the Sherman, if they could understand its systems and bring it back to life, maybe they could keep moving. Not forward, no one believed in victory anymore, just away from the collapse, towards something else. Survival was all that remained. That night, Otto took the first inventory by lantern light. The transmission appeared serviceable. The radio was blown. The turret traversed manually but not smoothly. And yet, the simplicity of the design was what struck him most. American tanks were not beautiful or elegant. They were blunt instruments, easy to repair, easy to operate, and terrifying in their sheer volume. For the first time, he wondered if that simplicity was the very reason they were losing. As the orchard cooled and the stars came out, the Sherman sat like a sleeping animal at the edge of their firelight, and no one could stop staring. By dawn, the decision was no longer a question. Lieutenant Falkenrath gathered the crew around the Sherman and gave a quiet nod, the kind that carried more weight than a shouted command. No one protested. Orders had ceased to flow from Berlin weeks ago, and the maps in their packs were little more than suggestions drawn in a different reality. The high command might still exist on paper, but out here, in the dying edge of France, they were alone. If the Sherman could be made to move, then it would become their new command structure, a mobile piece of steel salvation, even if it bore the wrong flag. Work began immediately. Otto and Weber took to the engine first, peeling back access panels and clearing debris. It was astonishing how quickly they fell into rhythm. There was no arguing, no talk of national pride or irony. The tank was simply a puzzle, and their hands remembered how to solve mechanical problems. The Sherman's radial engine was of a type they had only studied in captured manuals, but the concepts were universal. It had been scorched in places, yet nothing catastrophic, no cracked block, no melted internals. Its core had survived, even if the war hadn't. Private Klaus spent the morning scavenging for tools and usable parts from wreckage nearby. In the field behind the orchard were the twisted remnants of a half-track and 2 motorcycles, German and American alike. He returned carrying armfuls of belts, hoses, and a rusted crowbar. "No ammo," he muttered as he passed Otto. "Just bodies and buttons." Otto didn't look up. He was elbow-deep in the Sherman's side compartment, his hands black with oil, his brain already committed to the next 10 steps. As the sun rose higher, the orchard became a forge. sweat soaked through uniforms long stiff from dirt and blood. Falkenrath drew sketches in the dirt, calculating weight ratios, sketching possible escape routes based on a tank that no longer existed on any operational ledger. They would use the Sherman not as a weapon, but as a mule to carry them east, to get them as far from the collapse as possible. Tow the broken Panther, if they had to. Steal fuel, cross rivers, anything to avoid the front that had consumed so many like them. But no one dared say the word desertion. They weren't cowards, they had fought, they had bled, they had believed, but now that belief was cracking, same as the Panther's drive shaft, same as the Reich itself. They were soldiers without a country, mechanics without a factory, ghosts with wrenches and no destination. Only the Sherman gave them purpose. It was more than steel now. It was direction. By dusk, the crew had stripped out the clogged air filters, realigned the linkage rods, and flushed what little fuel they had into the tank's side port. They were guessing, improvising, speaking, half in curses and half in prayer. When Weber finally cranked the starter, there was a grinding pause, then a sputter, a cough, and a dull, living growl. The crew froze. No one celebrated. The sound was too sacred. For the first time in weeks, they had done something that felt like progress. The engine didn't purr like the Panther, it barked like a mutt. But it barked. Otto looked at Falkenrath, waiting for the next command. But the lieutenant simply looked away. There were no more orders, just momentum. They moved the Sherman only once that night, just far enough to nestle it deeper into the shadows beneath the orchard canopy. The engine's voice was hoarse and reluctant, but it moved, dragging its wounded tread in the mud like a limping dog. Falkenrath insisted on switching off the engine immediately after the maneuver, worried the sound might carry. They were not far from the last American patrol routes, though the lines were fluid now. One could walk for a mile and not know whose war they were inside. In the dark, with lanterns doused and only the pale shimmer of moonlight, the tank looked like a giant sleeping in the orchard's broken ribs. Morning came with fog and an aching stillness. Otto sat cross-legged beside the Sherman, scraping carbon buildup off spark plugs with a penknife. Each click of metal on metal felt reverent. Klaus crouched near the rear access panel, rubbing his fingers along the weld seams like a man reading Braille. No one spoke unless necessary. It had become ritual now, work first, then thought. Weber stood with a hammer over his shoulder, eyes unfocused, waiting for his part to begin again. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was necessary. The smell of oil had soaked into everything. Their uniforms were stained black, their hands permanently inked by grease. The Panther had been a noble machine, precise, complicated, powerful. But the Sherman was something else entirely. The more they took it apart and rebuilt it, the more they saw the difference not just in construction, but in philosophy. The American machine had been made for war in bulk. Every part was accessible, redundant, replaceable. It was the difference between a handcrafted saber and a field-issued rifle. Otto didn't say it out loud, but he had begun to admire the logic behind it. They found a wrench welded inside the hull with a wire, an emergency backup tool stashed where a soldier might grab it during a breakdown. A small detail, but telling. German tanks demanded technicians. American tanks expected soldiers to adapt. The Sherman had been built to survive without ceremony. Later that day, Weber climbed into the turret to test the traverse manually. The gears groaned in protest but turned. He spun it slowly, muscle against steel, the barrel sweeping across the orchard like a sundial. For a moment, it pointed toward the road they had come from, the one that led back to their last known post. Falkenrath watched without speaking. None of them had voiced the question aloud. What would they do if they actually made the tank fully functional? There were no orders, no rescue convoys, no units left to report to. All they had was the machine and the will to make it work. They took turns sleeping beside the Sherman that night, rifles beside their legs. Not from fear of an ambush, but because none of them could bear to be away from it for long. It was no longer just equipment. It was becoming the center of something unspoken, a kind of mechanical shrine to the idea that action still mattered. The world outside the orchard was collapsing. Inside, there was steel, oil, and silence, and somehow, that still felt like purpose. By the fourth day, they stopped thinking of it as an enemy tank. No one said it aloud, but the Sherman had ceased to be foreign. It didn't matter that it had once flown a white star on its side. That symbol was chipped and ghostly now, faded beneath streaks of oil and soot. The metal didn't care what flag it wore. It had become theirs, piece by piece, bolt by bolt. The crew no longer approached it with hesitation. They climbed into it as if returning to something familiar, like a home they hadn't realized they missed. Otto sat inside the driver's seat for the first time that morning. The view was narrow and claustrophobic, different from the German designs he was used to. But there was a logic to it. Controls were straightforward, the dials clear and sparse. He ran his hand along the edge of the dash and found a name scratched into the metal. Charlie. A name, not a serial number. It made him pause. This machine had belonged to someone, had carried its own story before falling into theirs. Corporal Weber was deep in the engine compartment, replacing the last of the belts with salvaged rubber from a wrecked ambulance. He'd been quiet for hours, muttering measurements under his breath, checking and rechecking clearances. "This thing was built to run forever," he finally said, voice echoing through the hull. "Not beautiful, but smart. Everything has room to breathe." It was the first time he'd complimented an Allied machine without sarcasm. Falkenrath had taken over ration duty and perimeter checks, though they all knew the chances of enemy contact were slim. The Americans had pushed farther east, the fighting had moved toward the heart of Germany, and the land they occupied now was contested by no one. Still, discipline mattered. Routine kept madness at bay. And besides, they had adopted the American tank. It felt appropriate to adopt the American habit of pretending order still existed. Private Klaus discovered the manual beneath the radio mount. Half-burned but legible, it contained diagrams, maintenance schedules, and emergency procedures. He read it aloud with dry humor, translating the English slowly. "If engine fails in combat, remain calm. Check fuel lines. Check distributor. Check soul for sins." The others chuckled, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it all finally cracked the surface of their fatigue. Humor had returned like a long-lost friend, awkward and necessary. By mid-afternoon, they managed a successful full start. The engine ran smoother this time, no coughing or hesitation. Otto eased the tank forward 2 meters, then back again. The motion was jerky, but promising. They didn't cheer. They just looked at each other and nodded. Each day, they moved closer to something, though none of them could say what. Home wasn't a place anymore. Orders didn't matter. The Sherman had become the only direction they trusted. That night, as they sat under the twisted trees eating cold bread and dried meat, Otto pulled out a crumpled photo of his younger sister. He showed it to no one, just stared at it for a long time before slipping it into the tank's dashboard beside Charlie's name. He didn't know why. Maybe it was a ritual. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe he just needed the tank to understand who he was. They found him 2 days later, curled beneath a fallen timber in the hollowed-out remains of a barn. At first glance, he looked like a scavenger. Maybe another deserter trying to stay invisible. But the moment Klaus raised his rifle, the boy lifted his hands and muttered something in shaky English. "Radio. Mine's broken." His face was smeared with soot, his uniform ragged and stained, but unmistakably American. A patch still clung to his shoulder, a thunderbolt on faded cloth, and the pistol at his side was rusted shut in its holster. He couldn't have been more than 17. Falkenrath ordered him searched, and the boy didn't resist. He had a canteen, a tin of cigarettes, and a small battered field radio with a cracked dial and snapped antenna. The insignia marked him as a communication tech, likely left behind in the retreat or lost in the chaos. When asked if he was alone, the boy just shrugged. "Don't know," he whispered. "I was running, got scared, didn't want to die." His voice cracked near the end, not with performance, but exhaustion. They debated what to do. Klaus wanted to let him go. Weber wanted to tie him up and keep moving. Otto, strangely, said nothing. It was Falkenrath who made the decision. "He stays with us. He knows more about that tank than we do." No one argued. Even the boy seemed relieved. They didn't learn his name until later. Ezra. From somewhere in Pennsylvania. He barely looked like a soldier, and yet, in his silence, there was something oddly steady, like a person who had already accepted death but kept moving anyway. They didn't treat him like a prisoner. Not exactly. He ate what they ate, slept under the same trees, and was given his own spot beside the Sherman, though always under watch. In the hours that followed, Ezra inspected the tank like a surgeon reviewing another man's work. He asked no questions, gave no lectures, but corrected their repairs with short, confident movements. He had grown up around machines, he said. His father had run a garage. He didn't care that they were Germans. Steel's the same either side, he muttered once, tapping the Sherman's side panel. Doesn't care who you're running from. Otto found himself watching the boy closely. There was something jarring about his calm. Ezra didn't seem afraid of them. Not because he was brave, but because he was too tired to care. He had seen more than he was supposed to, maybe killed someone he hadn't meant to. He looked at the war like someone who had been betrayed by it, but still carried its tools. One evening, Ezra sat inside the Sherman and adjusted the calibration on the transmission. Otto climbed in beside him. They didn't speak for a while. Then the boy said, "You ever seen the inside of one of your own tanks after a shell hits it?" Otto nodded. Ezra didn't look surprised. "Then you know it's all the same. Steel, fire, screaming, then quiet." That night, no one kept watch. They just slept, the American included. The orchard had become their whole world, and there was no one left to be at war with. They began the real scavenging once Ezra confirmed the Sherman's drive system could hold if they reinforced the differential and bypassed a warped axle with a spliced part. It was an ugly solution, barely functional by any standard of military repair, but it would move them east if they fed it enough fuel and kept the road smooth. But fuel wasn't the only problem. They needed metal. They needed bolts, clamps, belts, rubber, and cable things that didn't exist in tidy boxes anymore, only in the ruined bones of other machines and the corpses of lost men. The wreckage fields were thick in that region. Old battle lines, cratered and overgrown, where retreat had crushed against advance again and again. They moved through it like surgeons through a morgue, taking what they needed with silent hands. German trucks half buried in ditches, burned-out jeeps with their wheels sheared off. One French delivery van, riddled with bullets, still had lengths of hose in the back seat. Falkenrath issued no orders. Everyone knew what to do. The scavenging was its own language now. Ezra proved useful in ways they hadn't expected. He could identify American parts faster than any of them. He'd pop a hood, trace a fuel line with 2 fingers, and nod before anyone else had figured out what they were looking at. He never asked why they were doing it. He just worked. The German crew no longer viewed him as a prisoner, not even as a guest. He was part of the machine now, not the tank, but the act of survival it represented. They found their first body on the 3rd day. A German lieutenant slumped in the back of a truck, mouth open, eyes clouded, half his skull missing. Weber didn't flinch. He reached past the corpse and yanked out the ignition coil they needed. Klaus crossed himself quietly and walked away. They found more bodies after that. British, French, American, civilian. Some fresh, some unrecognizable. No one said a word. The war had given up speaking to them in commands or speeches. Now it only whispered in the language of decay and rot. Each piece they took came at a cost. Otto noticed the silence deepening between them, even between him and Ezra. The boy had grown thinner, more pale, and spoke only when spoken to. Falkenrath began to mark parts with charcoal on the inside, a private system only he understood. Klaus started carving tally marks into the Sherman's interior wall, not to count kills, but salvages. He called them ghost pieces. Every mark was a reminder that their salvation came from the dead. On one of the runs, Ezra found a woman's locket in the glove compartment of an American truck. Inside was a picture of a child, maybe 3 years old. He showed it to Otto, who stared at it for a long time before shaking his head. They didn't keep it. They left it on the dashboard and moved on. By the end of the week, the Sherman had been patched with parts from no fewer than 7 vehicles, Allied and Axis, soldier and civilian. It was a Frankenstein's tank now, stitched together by necessity, but it ran. Barely. And each time it rumbled to life, it felt like it did so on borrowed time and borrowed bones. Chapter 7. Learning the enemy. The more they rebuilt the Sherman, the more they learned about the men who had built it. Not just the mechanics, those had become familiar, but the mindset behind the design. Otto kept a notebook now, jotting down every quirk he discovered. The way the fuel system rerouted pressure during uphill climbs, the reinforced guard over the transmission box, the placement of spare shells along the interior wall. These weren't just technical choices. They were choices made by a country that expected its machines to be used by amateurs, repaired by anyone, and replaced often. Falkenrath, once dismissive of Allied engineering, no longer scoffed at the simplicity. "They didn't build these to last," he muttered one morning, watching the others torque down a suspension arm. "They built them to survive long enough to matter." There was bitterness in his voice, but something else too, a hint of respect he couldn't quite name. Weber began keeping count of each system they had successfully restored. Gun elevation, ventilation, throttle response. Each checkmark came with a nod, a grunt, and a lengthening silence. Even Klaus, who had once cursed anything American on sight, stopped calling the Sherman names. It had become a quiet teacher. Its blunt, inelegant form revealed truths about the enemy they had never understood while fighting him face to face. Ezra rarely spoke unless directly asked. He sat in the loader's seat during most repairs, watching them work, occasionally reaching out to correct a grip or suggest an adjustment. Once, while Klaus struggled to fit a mismatched coupling onto the fuel line, Ezra leaned over and tapped the correct side. "Wrong angle," he said. "American threading's wider." Then he went back to silence, fiddling with the broken radio he refused to abandon. Otto had begun reading his notebook aloud at night, testing theories about what the Sherman's design implied. "They don't waste time on polish. It's like they're not trying to impress anyone, just outlast them." Falkenrath nodded slowly, then said, "That's what makes them dangerous. We made machines to honor the Reich. They made machines to kill Nazis." The irony was not lost on anyone. They were rebuilding a weapon designed to destroy them, not out of betrayal, but survival. And in doing so, they were beginning to see the war from the other side of the gun sight. It wasn't just about territory or honor anymore, it was about endurance. The Americans had built a war machine that didn't care about aesthetics or loyalty. It only cared about function. And that, Otto realized, was why they were winning. One night, as they sat in the grass sharing a tin of cold beans, Ezra looked at the tank and said softly, "It's weird watching you fix it." Otto didn't reply. "We built those so fast, most of us didn't think they'd come back at all." He tapped his boot against the ground, then added, "But maybe that's what made them work." In the darkness, the Sherman gleamed under moonlight like a sleeping predator. They were learning more than how to repair a tank. They were learning why they had already lost. It was Klaus who found it wedged behind the co-driver's seat, tucked beneath a folded American wool blanket stiff with age and soot. At first he thought it was just another burned field manual, but the leather was soft, worn, smooth from handling. When he flipped it open, the handwriting stopped him cold. Not English, printed for clarity, but cursive personal, slanted, emotional, private. Otto took it from him and turned a few pages without speaking. The entries began in early spring. The last was dated 3 days before the Sherman was abandoned in the orchard. It belonged to a Captain Louis R. Mathers, commander of the armored platoon this Sherman had belonged to. The opening lines were straightforward coordinates, supply updates, repair notes, but quickly gave way to something more intimate. Observations about his crew, jokes shared over morning coffee, doubts, regrets. There was a photograph tucked inside the back cover, 4 young men smiling beside the tank, sleeves rolled up, sun high above them. One of them, likely Mathers, had written in ink beneath the image, "We name it Charlie because it refuses to die." They read the entries aloud that evening, passing the book from man to man like contraband. Ezra remained silent, though his eyes rarely left the diary. The German crew listened with a kind of reverence, as if they were hearing a confession from a ghost. The Americans weren't caricatures in this book. They were human, tired, confused, trying to make sense of a war that never told them the truth. It was both familiar and jarring. One entry described a skirmish with German forces just west of the orchard. They had the high ground. "We lost Bauer and Finch. I can still hear the Panther's engine in my dreams. But the tank kept moving. Charlie doesn't care who fires the shell, she just wants forward." Otto read that part twice, slower the second time. The mention of the Panther hit harder than expected. That could have been their unit. It could have been them firing down from that ridge. They might have killed Mathers's friends. They might have left this tank for dead, And now here they were, rebuilding it. Later pages took on a darker tone, rations running low, radio silence, a sense of abandonment. The final entry was short and clean. If we don't make it, I hope someone finds this and knows we were here. We tried. That was all. No rage, no poetry, just a fading signature beneath it all. The men sat in silence for a long while after the reading. No one said what they were thinking, but the air between them had changed. The tank had a soul now, or at least the memory of one. Otto tucked the diary back beneath the seat where they had found it, almost ritualistically. "We leave it there," he said. "It belongs." That night, Weber added one more bolt to the reinforced wheel mount and tapped the hull gently with his knuckle. "Charlie," he said under his breath. "Stubborn bastard." The tank didn't answer. It didn't need to. By the 10th day, the Sherman was functional in every way that mattered. The engine purred like a half-wounded beast, the turret rotated freely, and the controls responded with a crude but dependable rhythm. They'd scavenged enough fuel to carry them east for perhaps 2 full days, assuming the roads were passable and the bridges intact. Ezra had even patched the radio with parts stripped from an old American Jeep, though the signal was weak and the antenna too short to catch much beyond static. But none of that mattered anymore, not really. Because even as the tank came alive, the world around them continued to die. They heard the first rumors of Berlin's fall over a scratchy intercepted broadcast. Ezra was twisting the dial late one night, kneeling beside the Sherman while the others slept. His voice cut through the orchard's quiet like a crack in glass. Something about a red flag. Reichstag. Surrender, maybe. He looked up, eyes hollow. "It's over." Or almost. No one responded right away. Not Falkenrath, who had stopped shaving and now looked like a man twice his age. Not Klaus, who had begun talking to himself in whispers. And not Otto, who had read the last page of the diary 5 more times since dawn. What was left to say? They were soldiers with no army, men in a foreign machine on the wrong side of a war that no longer needed them. The Sherman could move, but to where? They laid out the maps again that morning, smoothing them over the warm hull of the tank. Everything east was marked in red pencil, enemy occupied, impassable, or meaningless. Everything west was destroyed or crawling with forces that wouldn't hesitate to shoot a German tank on sight, no matter what flag it flew. Falkenrath tapped the edge of the map and muttered, "Too much fuel, not enough purpose." Then he walked away. Ezra, surprisingly, was the one who spoke next. "There's a checkpoint a few kilometers north, Supply Road. If you want to surrender, that's where they'll process you." The word lingered between them like a bitter wind. Surrender. None of them had said it before. They'd hinted, joked, danced around it. But now it stood bare in the air, undeniable. The war had already left them behind. Only pride remained, and it was beginning to rot. Weber kicked at a pile of spent casings near the Salvaged tree line. "We didn't build this thing to surrender in it," he spat. Otto disagreed silently. Maybe they had. Maybe that was all they'd ever been doing, building their own escape from the story they were supposed to believe in. That afternoon, they loaded the Sherman with what few supplies they had left: water, dry bread, ammunition they no longer expected to use. They painted a makeshift white flag on the side panel, a ragged surrender cloth tied to the barrel. No one gave orders, no one protested. They simply moved. The tank rolled forward through the orchard like it had risen from the dead, its engine singing low and steady. As they drove, the land looked different. Not France, not Germany, just aftermath. Empty farmhouses, fields of rusted metal, roads choked with the footprints of people fleeing or chasing something they no longer remembered. And behind them, the orchard stood still, the last place they had believed in anything. They traveled north beneath a sky bruised by smoke, the sun, a pale coin behind drifting ash. The Sherman moved slower than expected, but it moved, wheels grinding against torn roads, engine laboring up hills with mechanical groans that echoed across the fields. No other vehicles passed them, no soldiers waved them down. The war had gone quiet in that part of France, like a beast that had fed too long and finally fallen asleep in its own filth. On the second evening, as they camped near the remains of a bombed-out chapel, Ezra climbed back into the tank to adjust the radio. He had patched it as best he could, splicing wires with shaking hands, antenna held together with twine and melted solder. He fiddled with the dials long after the others had stopped asking what he was doing. For him, it had become ritual, a way to connect to a war that no longer had room for individuals. That night, something changed. Otto had just finished sharpening his knife, a habit from the old days, no longer useful but still calming, when he heard the static shift. A faint voice, buried beneath layers of distortion, cut through the stillness. Ezra didn't move at first, just leaned closer to the speaker, listening. Then, without turning, he called out, "Come here, you need to hear this." The crew gathered around the Sherman like pilgrims around a relic. Ezra adjusted the frequency until the voice grew louder, clearer. American accent, calm, professional, the kind of voice meant to be recorded. It was a broadcast, but not for civilians. It was for soldiers. From somewhere east, possibly Germany. Effective immediately, German forces in the capital have surrendered unconditionally. Allied troops occupy key military districts. Ceasefire observed in multiple sectors. Repeat, Berlin has fallen. The Reich has surrendered. War in Europe is at its end. No one moved. The voice continued for another minute, offering logistical details, evacuation routes, prisoner transport procedures. Then the static returned. The tank's interior, lit only by a lantern, seemed smaller than before, as if the news had shrunk the air inside it. Falkenrath stepped away first, walking out into the open field and staring up at the stars. Weber sat down heavily on a crate and rubbed his eyes like he was trying to wipe away everything he'd ever seen. Klaus whispered something no one could hear and began packing his bag, even though they weren't going anywhere. Otto remained beside Ezra, watching him carefully. "What now?" he asked. Ezra didn't answer right away. He stared at the radio, now quiet, as if hoping it might change its mind. Then he said, "Now you figure out who you are without a war to explain it." It was a strange sentence, too thoughtful for someone so young. But it landed. Hard. That night, they didn't light a fire. They sat inside the tank, not for warmth, but because it was the only place that still made sense. In silence, they listened to the last words of a war that had consumed them, only to spit them out with no conclusion, no closure, just static. And outside, in the dark, the world moved on without them. The white flag fluttered limply from the Sherman's barrel, stained with soot and grease. It looked more like a surrender of breath than a declaration, the final exhale of a machine that had witnessed too much. Falkenrath had been the one to tie it on, silent and precise, hands trembling only after the knot was done. No one commented on the symbolism. They all understood what the tank had become. It was no longer a weapon. It was a casket carrying them out of history. They made it within sight of the supply checkpoint by late morning. The road bent downward into a shallow valley where a small cluster of American vehicles sat in idle formation. A flagpole stood to one side, stars and stripes waving confidently above the field. Sandbags marked the perimeter. Machine gun nests were built into the embankments, but no barrels turned in their direction. Not yet. Falkenrath ordered them to stop just before the ridge. "We walk from here," he said. "Let them see our faces." It was the right call. No one wanted to risk being mistaken for an advancing threat in a stolen Sherman. Klaus removed his sidearm and dropped it in the mud. Weber did the same. Even Otto, who had carried his Luger since Poland, handed it to Ezra without a word. The boy looked confused for a moment, then tucked it carefully into a canvas pouch. They approached the checkpoint in formation, hands visible, eyes forward. The Americans noticed them quickly. Rifles were raised, but not fired. An officer emerged from a jeep, tall and sun-browned, his helmet pushed back to reveal a skeptical frown. Behind him, younger soldiers stared at the approaching Germans, mouths half open. One pointed back toward the Sherman still idling on the hill and muttered, "They drove that?" Otto stepped forward when the officer demanded identification. He spoke slowly, clearly, his German accent thick but manageable. "We were a Panzer crew. We salvaged it. We didn't fire a shot." Ezra stood behind them, quiet and unrestrained. His presence confused the Americans more than the tank. One of them recognized him and shouted his name. Ezra waved half-heartedly and said, "They're not what you think." The interrogation began within the hour, in a tent, at gunpoint. But the tone changed quickly. Once the Americans heard the full account, the days in the orchard, the repairs, the diary, the decision not to fight suspicion began to soften. Falkenrath explained the entire process like a man giving a confession rather than a defense. Klaus translated where needed, his voice flat, as if it no longer belonged to him. Otto watched the officer's expression shift from doubt to curiosity, then to something like understanding. Not approval. Not forgiveness. Just recognition, one soldier seeing another, both broken in different ways. The American finally said, "You brought a Sherman back from the dead and didn't even try to shoot us with it." Otto replied, "We brought it back to survive. That was all." By the time they were processed into the camp as prisoners, the Sherman had already been towed to a clearing outside the checkpoint for inspection. Engineers and mechanics circled it, like archaeologists uncovering a lost artifact. Someone asked who had done the welding on the rear access plate. Weber raised his hand. The American stared at him for a long moment, then simply said, "Not bad." The tank would never fire again. The breech was welded shut. The ammo stores had long been emptied, but it still carried power not in destruction, but in memory. And that, somehow, felt like the only kind of power they had left. The prisoner camp was not what they expected. There were fences, yes, tall, chain-linked, and topped with rusting wire, but no snarling dogs, no shouting guards. Just a kind of worn-down quiet, as though the war had passed over this place and left it to decay gently. The Germans were processed quickly, given uniforms without insignia, their personal items logged and boxed away. Ezra disappeared into another tent, surrounded by familiar faces who asked him questions too quickly for the others to hear. When Otto caught a glimpse of him again, the boy looked distant as if part of him was already gone. They were taken to a common yard where dozens of other German prisoners milled about in various states of dazed inactivity. Most had come from collapsed units, survivors of retreats that never ended. Some looked barely older than boys. Others wore the empty stare of veterans who had outlived their own principles. No one jeered. No one asked questions. The newcomers were just absorbed, like drops into a still pool. But news traveled fast in places like that. Within a day, everyone knew about the Sherman. Whispers spread like wildfire. A German crew, driving an American tank, walking it into camp like a wounded animal. Some laughed, some were angry. One prisoner muttered, "You should have driven it off a cliff." But most said nothing, because deep down, they understood. The war had made all of them scavengers of the enemy's tools and their own fading dignity. Otto noticed the stares when they walked through the yard, not of hostility, but curiosity. Falkenrath, tall and still sharp in posture, drew the most attention. But it was Klaus who first broke the silence. He told the story to another group of prisoners in the mess line. The orchard, the repair, the boy with the radio. He spoke with the simplicity of a man who no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. That night, one of the American guards approached Otto. A stocky man with tobacco-stained fingers and a southern accent, he didn't speak like an interrogator. He just said, "You drove that thing for 2 weeks through wreckage and silence. You know, half our boys wouldn't have even tried." Otto nodded, unsure whether it was a compliment or a challenge. "We didn't drive it for war," he said quietly. "We drove it because we couldn't walk anymore." The tank had been parked just beyond the edge of the camp, roped off, tarped partially to protect it from the elements. But the prisoners could see it from the fence, the curved armor, the patched plating, the painted ghost of the white flag still tied to the barrel. It stood out like a monument in the landscape of wire and fatigue. Some prisoners avoided looking at it, others stared too long, as if hoping to see themselves reflected back in its dull steel. For Otto and his crew, it had become something sacred, not because it was American, not because it had saved them, but because it had listened. When the world had collapsed and every system had failed, the tank had still responded to hands and tools and effort. And now, behind barbed wire, surrounded by silence and strangers, the only thing they trusted was the memory of that hum beneath their feet, the slow, mechanical heartbeat of a machine that asked no questions and told no lies. They called it an interview, not an interrogation. But the room still had a single metal chair, a single flickering light, and the unmistakable smell of disinfectant and nervous sweat. Otto sat with his hands flat on the table, back straight, eyes on the American officer across from him, a young man with a receding hairline and a stack of papers held together with fraying string. A translator sat nearby, but Otto answered in slow, deliberate English. It was not the first time he'd been questioned since the surrender, but it was the first time they asked about the tank in detail. "Why did you fix it?" the officer asked, not accusatory, just curious. Otto answered honestly, "Because we couldn't fix ours. And we didn't want to die on foot." The officer nodded and scribbled something. "You had weapons? No shells. No intention. You could have fled east, tried to join with remaining units." Otto shook his head. There were no units. Only ghosts. The officer set down his pen and leaned forward. "Did you feel conflicted? Driving something meant to kill your own countrymen?" Otto looked at him evenly. "By the time we got it running, we had no countrymen left." The silence stretched between them. The translator cleared his throat, but the officer waved him off. "One of our engineers said your welding was too clean to be done under duress. Care to explain?" Otto allowed a tired smile. "We weren't in a hurry. We had nothing else to do but survive." The conversation turned clinical after that: fuel usage, repair methods, engine performance. Otto answered each question plainly. When they asked about the diary found inside the Sherman, he hesitated. "We read it. We kept it in the same place. It belonged to the man who lived in that tank before us." The officer nodded and wrote something longer this time. After an hour, Otto was dismissed and Klaus was called in next, then Weber, then Falkenrath. Each gave their own version of the same story: the orchard, the radio, the boy, the welding, the drive. Nothing about combat, nothing about resistance. Just movement, slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. Ezra was questioned separately, though they never told the Germans what he'd said. They only noticed that after the interviews, the guards treated them differently. Not warmer, not kinder, but more curious. Like people trying to understand something they couldn't quite name. That evening, as they returned to the barracks, Otto passed the fence line and saw the Sherman again. An American mechanic stood beside it, hands on hips, staring up at the turret. He looked over as Otto passed and asked, "She really ran smooth for you, huh?" Otto paused. "She ran like she wanted to go home." The mechanic gave a soft chuckle. "Hell of a thing." Then he walked away, leaving Otto standing alone, with the moon rising behind the tank. Inside the barracks, the others waited in silence. No one asked what had been said. They didn't need to. The interrogations weren't about justice or blame. They were about understanding, and maybe, just maybe, about acknowledging something rare: that 4 enemy soldiers, given no orders and no hope, had chosen not to die, not to fight, but to fix. It was the engineers who uncovered the full extent of the repairs. 2 American officers in pressed uniforms and grease-streaked sleeves spent 3 full days disassembling parts of the Sherman, inspecting every weld, every jury-rigged coupling, every scavenged bolt. They spoke in low voices but often fell silent when they found something that shouldn't have worked yet did. One called it an impossible patchwork, held together by blind faith and desperation. The other, more practical, called it a miracle of necessity. Word of their findings reached the higher-ups in the camp. Suddenly, Otto and the others were summoned again, not for another interrogation, but for a debriefing. This time, the tone was entirely different. There was no table, no translator, just a colonel in his early 40s, flanked by 2 aides, who stood beside the tank with his arms crossed, looking not at them, but at the machine. "You knew what you were doing," he said without introduction. "This wasn't luck," Falkenrath replied first. "We knew what we were doing with our hands, not always with our minds." The colonel turned. "You welded the breach shut. That was your choice?" Weber nodded. "We didn't want temptation." The colonel stared at him for a moment, then back at the tank. "She could have fired again. You made sure she didn't." The silence between the men was thick with unspoken acknowledgement. The Americans had expected sabotage, maybe desperation. What they found instead was discipline, a different kind of loyalty. Not to a country, not to orders, but to something else entirely. Survival, dignity, peace. The colonel motioned to one of his aides, who opened a folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It contained sketches not of the tank, but of the modifications. Diagrams of the fuel rerouting, the suspension reinforcement, the radio splice. They'd mapped the entire process. It looked like a schematic of resilience. "We're keeping it," the colonel said finally. "Not for war, for memory." Otto didn't respond. He just nodded once, slow and firm. That night, they were allowed a final visit to the Sherman before it was relocated. Just the four of them, no guards, no restraints. The machine stood under a canvas tarp near the edge of the motor pool, lanterns flickering against its worn surface. Ezra joined them quietly, hands in his pockets, eyes soft with something between pride and sadness. Klaus climbed up first, fingers running along the barrel, tracing the flaking white flag still tied at the end. "It never wanted to kill anyone," he said, more to himself than the others. Inside, the tank smelled of old oil and dry air. The captain's diary was still tucked beneath the seat, untouched. Otto hesitated, then picked it up and leafed through it again. The last page stared back at him. "We tried." He placed it back, gently, and whispered, "So did we." Outside, Falkenrath stood with Ezra, watching the sky. "They'll use it to tell a story now," he said. Ezra nodded. "Let them. It's a good one." As they walked away, the tank remained, silent, but not forgotten. It had become something else, not a weapon, not a trophy, but proof that even in the collapse of nations, a machine built for war could be repurposed for truth. The days settled into a rhythm that felt eerily like peace, though none of them dared to call it that. The prison camp functioned more like a small town than a military facility now. The war was over, the rifles were holstered, and the fences stood not to keep people in, but to give shape to a place that no longer knew what to do with its occupants. The guards relaxed, the prisoners formed routines, and life, somehow, resumed. Otto found himself working in the motor depot, assisting American mechanics with everything from trucks to mess hall generators. At first, it was strange taking instructions in English, reaching for tools handed to him by men who, a year earlier, would have shot him on sight. But they didn't treat him like a prisoner. They treated him like a man who knew engines. The war had taken their youth, but it hadn't erased their respect for a good pair of hands. Weber spent his mornings organizing scrap metal and spare parts, the same way he had done in the orchard, though now under fluorescent light and with a clipboard. The Americans teased him at first for being so serious, but soon they began asking him for advice. "Where'd you learn this stuff?" one of them asked. Weber shrugged. "Building ghosts in the woods." Klaus volunteered in the kitchen. He said it was the only place that reminded him of home. He sliced vegetables in silence, scrubbed pans until his fingernails bled, and never complained. Once, a young American cook asked him why he always hummed the same tune. Klaus smiled faintly. "Because it's the only thing I brought with me that didn't belong to the war." Falkenrath kept mostly to himself. He took long walks around the fence perimeter, hands behind his back, always observing. Occasionally, he'd sit in the camp library, leafing through English textbooks, muttering the words under his breath. He refused to take up any post, not out of pride but because, he once said, "I spent too many years doing what I was told. I'll spend the rest deciding for myself." As for Ezra, he visited only once after their release into the general camp population. He wore a clean uniform and carried a clipboard, but his eyes were the same. He spoke quietly with Otto, asked how they were adjusting, then handed him something wrapped in brown paper. It was a photograph of the Sherman, now cleaned, polished, placed on a concrete slab beside an American flag. A plaque had been mounted beneath the barrel. Otto didn't read it. He just folded the paper and nodded. There were no speeches, no medals, no formal thank yous, just days that followed one another without explosions, without commands, without fear. And in those days, something unfamiliar began to grow, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they had not survived simply to remember what was lost, but to rebuild something that had never been real in the first place. At night, Otto would sometimes dream of the orchard, not of the trees, or the broken panther, or even the wreckage, but of the moment the Sherman first coughed to life. That mechanical breath, that second chance. He would wake before dawn, breathe deep, and go back to work. Because now, there was nothing left to fix except themselves. Years passed. The world changed. Wars ended and began again in other places, under different names, with different flags. Nations rebuilt, Cities rose from ash, and soldiers became civilians, or statues, or ghosts. The tank, however, did not move. It stood exactly where they had left it, not in the mud of a French orchard or the edge of a prison yard, but behind a velvet rope in a quiet hall of an American war museum. It had been cleaned, restored partially, but not entirely. The engineers made a decision early on. Let the welds stay jagged. Let the patchwork remain visible. The white flag was preserved and mounted beside it, yellowed and fragile, like a butterfly's wing pressed beneath glass. Visitors passed by it every day, most reading the plaque without truly seeing it. Children pointed at the gun barrel. Veterans stood in silence a little longer than most, but only a few ever asked what made this Sherman different from the rest. The plaque told only part of the story. It described a German Panzer crew who, during the final weeks of the war, salvaged an abandoned American tank and drove it across enemy lines not to fight, but to surrender. It noted the repairs, the lack of ammunition, the welded breach. It praised the ingenuity, but it didn't capture the silence of the orchard, the boy with the radio, the diary under the seat, or the long nights filled with doubt and aching hands. Otto visited the museum once, not immediately after the war, but years later, long after he had settled in a small town as a mechanic for delivery trucks. He didn't tell anyone who he was. He paid his entrance fee, walked the echoing hallways, and stopped in front of the tank like any other curious guest. A child stood beside him, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugging at his father's sleeve and asking if the tank had ever killed anyone. Otto didn't answer. He just looked at the machine. He could still hear its cough on cold mornings, feel the rattle of the patched tracks beneath his boots, remember the way they all breathed easier once it started. He wondered if the others had come too. Weber had written to him once a short letter, nothing sentimental. Klaus had disappeared into post-war Germany, quiet and unreachable. Falkenrath, he had never expected him to write at all. Otto stepped closer to the tank and reached out, not to touch, but to see if his hand still remembered the shape. He saw the spot where his weld held the suspension in place. He saw the patched radio antenna stub still mounted above the hatch. And he saw, beneath the seat inside the crew compartment, the edge of a leather diary barely visible, left exactly where it had always been. He smiled. Just slightly. Then he turned and walked away, the sound of children's voices rising behind him, the hum of modern air conditioning replacing the wind of that long-ago orchard. Outside, the sun was shining. The war was over. The tank remained not as a symbol of victory or defeat, but of something far more rare: mercy, memory, and the quiet, stubborn choice to survive without hatred.